The signal came through static, and my hands were shaking before I even understood the words. 3 warships had crossed into the quiet system where we lived, and they were not asking for permission to land. I am Ren, and the last time I felt fear like this, I was small enough to fit inside a single human hand. My brother Callum was already moving before the message finished playing, pulling on his coat, checking the charge on the old defense grid we had built with scrap parts and stubborn hope. My sister Ivy stood at the window, watching 3 shapes grow larger against the stars, her jaw tight, her eyes calm in the way that always meant she was terrified and refusing to show it. None of us said the word out loud. We did not have to. Somewhere out there, in one of those ships, was the same bloodline that once called itself our family, and it had finally come looking for what it believed it was owed. I want to tell you how we got here, because none of this makes sense without the beginning, and the beginning was smaller and quieter than anything happening tonight. I was 6 years old, if you measured in the way humans do, when my father set me and my littermates down on a dusty supply station and walked away without looking back. He was not cruel. I understand that now, though it took me a long time to believe it. He was losing a war he could not explain to children, and he had run out of safe places to keep us, so he made a trade, the kind of trade desperate leaders make, and he left the 3 of us in the care of a woman named Grace Whitmore, a logistics officer who had never raised anything more demanding than a garden. She knelt down in front of us that first night, looked each of us in the eye, and said she did not know what we ate, or what frightened us, or what our names meant, but she was willing to learn if we were willing to teach her. Callum bared his teeth at her. Ivy hid behind my shoulder. I said nothing at all. Grace did not flinch, and she did not push. She simply left food by the door and let us come to her in our own time, which turned out to be exactly the right thing to do, because creatures raised on fear do not trust kindness that arrives too fast. It took months before Callum stopped growling every time she entered a room. It took longer before Ivy would eat in front of her. But Grace was patient in a way I had never seen an adult be patient, and slowly, without any of us noticing the exact moment it happened, we stopped waiting for her to hurt us. She taught us differently than we had been raised to expect, where our bloodline ran on the idea that the strongest voice in the room should always be obeyed. Grace ran on something else entirely. She asked us questions instead of giving commands. She let us make choices, and then let us feel the weight of those choices, good or bad. Because she said the only way to grow a mind that can lead is to let it stumble while the stakes are still small. She gave Callum control of the station's supply records when he was barely old enough to understand numbers, and when he made mistakes that cost her real time and real resources, she did not take the responsibility away. She said a person who is never allowed to fail never learns how to recover, and recovery, she told him, mattered more than perfection. She noticed that Ivy had an ear for patterns other people missed, the gap between what a message said and what it actually meant, and she nurtured that instinct until it became something sharp and unmistakable. And she noticed that I flinched at raised voices. That conflict made my chest go tight and my throat go dry, and instead of telling me to grow tougher, she told me that the ones who flinch are often the ones who listen best, if only they learn to trust what they hear. I did not understand any of this while it was happening. I only understood it slowly, in pieces, the way you understand the shape of a room after your eyes adjust to the dark. The years on that station were quiet, at least on the surface. Grace ran her supply operation, we grew taller and stronger, and the war that had once swallowed our family faded into something distant, something that felt like it belonged to another life. But wars do not stay distant forever, and one evening, when I was old enough to be considered nearly grown, a scout ship arrived without warning. It carried 3 soldiers from a war band led by a distant cousin of our father, a leader named Draven, who had heard a rumor that Thren's abandoned children were being raised soft on a forgotten outpost, and had decided that rumor was either an insult worth punishing or an opportunity worth claiming. He wanted us back, not out of love, out of the belief that our bloodline still belonged to him, whether we agreed or not. Grace stood between his soldiers and the 3 of us, with nothing in her hands but calm, steady words. She told them plainly that we were not property to be seized, and that whatever claim their leader believed he held, it would not be settled by force on her station. The soldiers laughed at her. They had grown up believing that gentle creatures like her could not stand against warriors like them. They were wrong, though not in the way they expected. We did not fight them with strength. We had spent years learning something far more dangerous than strength. Callum had spent those years mastering the station's system so completely that he could quietly redirect power, lock down corridors, and strand a hostile ship without firing a single shot. Ivy had spent those years learning to listen for exactly the kind of approach those soldiers were making, and she had already warned us 3 days before their scout ship even entered range. And I had spent those years learning that the person who controls the terms of a conversation controls the outcome of it, long before anyone raises their voice. By the time Draven's soldiers realized what was happening, their ship had no power to leave, their weapons had no reason to matter, and I was the one standing in front of them, delivering terms instead of receiving them. They left with nothing but a story to tell. And stories, it turns out, travel much faster than any ship. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. A clean victory that closed the chapter and let us return to our quiet life. It was not. It was only the beginning of something much larger, something none of us had intended to build. Word of what happened on that station spread through the scattered remains of our father's old war, and the story grew with every retelling, until it was no longer about 3 frightened children standing up to a handful of soldiers, but about the abandoned children of Thren who had somehow built something powerful enough to stop a warband cold. Broken crews began arriving, one at a time at first, then in greater numbers. They were not warriors looking for conquest. They were people who had lost their leaders, lost their direction, and were searching for something steady to hold on to. They did not want another commander who ruled through fear the way our bloodline always had. Whether they realized it or not, what they wanted was exactly what Grace had spent years quietly building inside the 3 of us, a kind of structure that did not collapse the moment one leader fell. We never intended to build an army. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to make this sound like some grand plan we designed from the very beginning. We did not. We were only trying to protect the life Grace had given us, and somewhere in that effort, without any single decision that felt like the turning point, a handful of broken crews became hundreds, and hundreds became more than we could count. People started calling us the Human-Raised Legion, half as a joke and half as something closer to reverence, even though not one of us carried a single drop of human blood. Grace hated the name every time she heard it. She always insisted she had not raised a legion, only 3 children who happened to grow into their responsibilities. But those children had grown into leaders who trusted each other completely, who had learned from her that loyalty built through choice runs deeper than loyalty built through fear. And that lesson spread through everyone who joined us, the same way it had once spread through our small family on a dusty station. Which brings me back to the 3 warships crossing into our system tonight, carrying the last of Draven's pride, and whatever soldiers he had managed to convince to follow him this far. He had waited years to come for us directly, gathering strength quietly, while we grew ours openly, and now he had finally decided the moment had come to settle what his soldiers failed to settle before. Callum reached the defense grid controls first, his hands steady despite the tension in his shoulders, and within moments he had every system on the station humming with quiet readiness. Ivy was already listening to the incoming transmissions, her eyes narrowing as she picked apart the layers of bravado hiding a much smaller force than Draven wanted us to believe he commanded. I stood at the center of it all, remembering the calm Grace had shown all those years ago, standing unarmed between us and soldiers who believed fear was the only language worth speaking. The first transmission from Draven's ship arrived moments later, his voice carrying the same cold authority I remembered from stories told about our father's old rivals, demanding that we surrender the station and return to the bloodline that had once abandoned us. I answered him myself, keeping my voice level even though my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I told him that the bloodline he spoke of had no claim over us, because we had never been raised to believe that blood alone earned obedience. I told him that everyone standing behind me on this station had chosen to be here, and that choice was worth more than any inherited authority he believed he carried. He laughed, the same way his soldiers once laughed at Grace, certain that words alone could not stop 3 warships from taking whatever they wanted. But words were never the only thing we had prepared. Ivy had already traced the exact formation of his approaching fleet, and she confirmed what her instincts had suspected from the start, that Draven had gathered far fewer loyal soldiers than his transmissions implied, padding his numbers with borrowed ships and desperate crews who had little reason to fight to the end for him. Callum used that information immediately, rerouting the station's outer defenses to create the illusion of a force far larger and far better prepared than we actually were, buying us time without wasting a single resource we could not spare. And I used the time they bought me to speak directly to the crews riding inside those borrowed ships, the ones who had joined Draven not out of loyalty but out of the same desperation that once nearly swallowed our own family. I told them the truth, plainly and without exaggeration. I told them that the structure Draven offered them was built on the same fear that had shattered countless packs before his, and that the only reason it still stood was because no one had yet given them a better option. I offered them that option, Not a promise of comfort, but a promise of choice. The same choice Grace had once given 3 frightened children on a forgotten station. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The silence between transmissions stretched so thin I could hear my own pulse in my ears, and I wondered if I had misjudged everything, if the crews listening to me would simply follow their orders and let the coming conflict decide what words could not. Then one ship broke formation. It was small, barely more than a transport with borrowed weapons bolted onto its hull, but it turned away from Draven's flagship and drifted toward our station instead, its crew signaling that they were done fighting battles that were never truly theirs to fight. A second ship followed shortly after, then a third, until Draven's once impressive fleet had shrunk down to a single flagship standing alone against a station that had somehow convinced his entire borrowed army to walk away without a single shot fired. I could hear the fury in his voice when he opened one final transmission, demanding to know what kind of trick we had used to turn his own soldiers against him. I told him it was not a trick at all. It was simply the same lesson Grace had taught the 3 of us years ago, that loyalty forced through fear will always crumble the moment something steadier is offered in its place. He had no answer for that, because there was no answer that fit within the world he had been raised to believe in. His flagship lingered at the edge of the system for a long while, engines idling, as if he could not decide whether retreating alone was worse than staying to fight a battle he could not possibly win. Eventually, without another transmission, without another threat, his ship turned and disappeared back into the dark he had come from. We did not celebrate that night the way I imagined people might celebrate a victory. There was no triumphant shouting, no wild relief spilling out into the corridors. Instead, there was a quiet, steady exhale, the feeling of people who had faced something enormous and come through it not because they were the strongest, but because they had built something worth protecting long before the threat ever arrived. Grace was not there to see it happen, though I thought of her the entire time. She had retired years earlier to a small garden 3 systems away, choosing a quieter life once she was certain the 3 of us no longer needed her standing between us and the world. When I finally reached her afterward and told her everything that had happened, she listened without interrupting. And when I finished, she said something I have carried with me ever since. She said she never raised a legion. She only raised 3 children who happened to grow up and become good at protecting the people who trusted them. I told her that every person who followed us that night had learned the same lesson she once taught 3 frightened cubs on a dusty station, that loyalty built on choice will always outlast loyalty built on fear, and that lesson does not end with us. It spreads to everyone who witnesses it, the same way it once spread quietly through our small, unlikely family. My father never returned for us after he left that day. He died years later, in a conflict none of us learned about until long afterward, and for a long time I believed that was the saddest part of this story. An alpha who abandoned his children and never lived to see what they became. I no longer believe that. I believe he did the one thing few leaders in his position ever managed to do. He looked at a structure that was failing all around him, and instead of clinging to it simply because it was his, he handed his children to someone capable of building them something far stronger, something that could outlast him entirely. He left us with a human, expecting nothing more than our survival. We did not return leading a pack built on inherited fear. We returned leading a legion built on chosen loyalty, and that is precisely why, no matter how many ships come looking for us in the future, it will never be taken from us the way it was so easily taken from him.